Hi, everyone. My name is Seville, and I'm the president of the Canadian Helpers Society. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here showing your support and interest in our programs. We are here in the second event in the New Horizons for Seniors program series of our organization. As you know, it's called Understanding Mental Health with Emma Dingo. As mentioned earlier, this session is part of the New Horizons for Seniors program, which is funded by the federal government of Canada. And before giving stage to our speaker, I would like to do territorial acknowledgement and also introduce Emma, who will be our today's speaker. I acknowledge that I'm located on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. The region of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land promised to the Six Nations that include 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. We respect and honor the diverse histories, languages, and cultures of all Indigenous peoples who call this territory home. We are committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. About our speaker, Emma Dingo, she's a young marketing and administrative assistant at Women in Crisis Algoma. It's a shelter supporting women fleeing domestic violence and abuse. She holds an honors bachelor's of global business and digital arts from the Waterloo, where she focused on postpartum mental health during her undergrad program. Emma is actively involved in supporting vulnerable populations, especially women and youth at risk, through workshops, trainings, and advocacy like this one. To make the best use of our time today, I'm excited to give the stage to Emma. Emma, over to you.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm very excited to be here. So we should just get right into it. So this session is about understanding mental health. I'm going to dive into some different things about what mental health is, ways we can acknowledge it, ways that it impacts our daily lives, and then go into a little bit of a segment about vulnerable populations and how mental health barriers exist there. So let's see here. Oops. All right. So just to start with a bit of a definition, this is from the World Mental Health Organization. And it says that mental health is a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn well and work well, and contribute to their community. So the World Mental Health Organization has listed this as a definition. There's a couple different definitions of mental health, but I think this one resonates the most. So ultimately, mental health is just your mental well-being in your head, in your mind, your thoughts, and how those impact and frame your everyday life. So now we're going to talk about impact, how mental health can impact us in our every single day life. So there's a couple different things that can be affected when we look at our mental health. The first being concentration and focus. So some folks who report struggling with mental health struggle to focus, whether that's at the office, whether that's in your everyday life, just at home. Concentration and focus can start to shift. A lot of times, folks who are dealing with anxiety, negative thoughts, it becomes difficult to concentrate on your every single day tasks when you're having these thoughts cloud your mind. The next is energy levels and fatigue. So normally, when we wake up, we're excited, we go to work, we do the things we need to do, we have energy throughout the day. When we start struggling with our mental health, sometimes these energy levels fluctuate. So that means we start feeling tired, we start feeling fatigue, we start losing energy, and it can impact how we start to live every single day, how we do tasks, how we do work, and folks who are struggling with mental health can report that they're feeling very tired, very low, their energy is low. Then we move on to motivation. This is a big one for a lot of folks dealing with mental health challenges. So when we look at motivation, this is like how we're feeling about doing things. When we're struggling with mental health, sometimes we feel like we don't want to go to work. We don't want to execute tasks. We don't have a lot of motivation or excitement about anything, starting to feel like a struggle to complete tasks. So A lot of times going to work, doing everyday tasks becomes a challenge. And that's when a lot of folks start to realize that their mental health might not be in a great place because they're not motivated to do much. And it becomes a struggle to execute those tasks. Then we have number 4, which is sleep patterns. So when mental health becomes a bit of a struggle, a lot of folks report that they're finding it difficult to sleep. They're up late at night, finding it hard to get to sleep, finding it hard to shut off their minds. A lot of times, sleep patterns can become inconsistent. So you're napping for long periods of time throughout the day. You're up late at night having difficult thoughts. And instead of being able to fall asleep and have a good sleep, your sleep becomes inconsistent. So a lot of people start seeing in their sleep patterns, oh, maybe my mental health is a little bit out of line because they're not sleeping well. Then we have social interaction / isolation. Now, it's important to note that mental health affects everyone differently, but some folks find that their social interactions will start to change. You start to isolate yourself. You feel overwhelmed by seeing friends, by seeing family. You find it difficult to be around other people because you're not feeling good yourself. This might look like isolating yourself, so not seeing other people, being stuck at home, being in your room. It can look different for everybody, but sometimes folks find that they're isolating, that they're not able to interact with others, and that it becomes a challenge. So that's something to look for. Then we go on to appetite and weight management. Now, again, this is just one of many different impacts. Some folks find that their appetite starts to change. They find it difficult to eat. They're finding it difficult to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Some folks who are really struggling with their mental health might lose some weight, or on the contrary, might gain weight because they're overeating or undereating. So this is just a sign to look for, a symptom to look for. If you're struggling to look at food, to eat food, to cook food, your motivation is down, that could be a sign of mental health challenges. Then we move on to emotional regulation and irritability. This is one of the signs that many folks report right away they notice. So every day when we're in good mental health, we're able to regulate our emotions. We're able to deal with feeling happy, with feeling sad, and we're able to kind of work through our everyday life challenges. When we start struggling with our mental health, that can become difficult. You may report feeling overwhelmed, having these big feelings, not being able to cope with them. And irritability is another big sign. When things start to upset us, we're irritable, we're easily upset. Our emotions feel a little bit all over the place. A lot of folks have that struggle where they're feeling out of control, where they're feeling like their emotions are taking over, our emotions are getting the best of us. This might be a sign for you that your mental health is struggling. The last one is self-care and hygiene. Again, this might not affect everyone the same way, but some folks find it difficult to take care of themselves. They start finding it difficult to maybe brush their teeth in the morning, to take a shower, even doing things as simple as putting on clothes to go to work. These become challenging. It becomes challenging to take care of yourself. Things like showering for hygiene, things like brushing your teeth, as I mentioned, these can become challenging. And again, this might not affect you necessarily this point. These are just examples and things to look for that your mental health might be starting to slip, or you might not be in a good place, because these are some things that can happen to just our daily routines and patterns. So this is a brief overview of mental health disorders. Now, this isn't a big focus in this presentation because I think when we talk about mental health as a spectrum, as a scope, we're more looking at how we're feeling every day, and not everyone struggles with mental health disorders. But I do think it's important to kind of just give an overview to go through, because if you are struggling with the mental health disorders, there's things in place, supports that you can get, and it's important to acknowledge them. But just because your mental health is feeling a little bit unstable, it doesn't mean necessarily you have a mental health disorder, just things to be aware of and things to look at. So the first is depression, and this is characterized by persistent sadness, loss of interest, and difficulty in daily functioning. Now, when we talk about mental health versus mental health disorders, You may be struggling with feeling irritable, feeling sad, feeling overwhelmed. That doesn't necessarily mean you have depression, but depression is something that impedes your everyday quality of life, where you're feeling such persistent sadness, such loss of interest that it's becoming challenging to function. This is when we start to go, oh, maybe there's a disorder at play here. So depression, essentially as a disorder, is when we're dealing with intense sadness, intense feelings of low energy, low feelings. That's what depression is kind of characterized as a mental health disorder. Then we look at anxiety disorders. Now, there's a couple different kinds of anxiety disorders, but the main thing here is we're looking at excessive fear and worry. You're feeling anxious, you're scared, you're worrying about things that are to come. And this relates to behavioral disturbances. So again, there's a couple different kinds of anxiety disorders. GAD, which is generalized anxiety disorder. This is just your standard anxiety. And again, when disorders become a concern is when they're getting in the way of your quality of life. You're not just feeling a little bit nervous here and there when something goes wrong. Your everyday life is being anxious. You're anxious about everything. Another form of anxiety is OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder. This is just another branch within the anxiety disorder umbrella. And that's characterized by compulsions, over compulsions. Then we look at psychotic disorders. Now, again, these can be characterized as distortions in thinking, perception, and behavior. Psychotic disorders aren't typically something that we deal with in our everyday lives. But again, it's important to be aware, just to know that if you're having distortions in your thinking, you know, different symptoms like that, that could be classified as a psychotic disorder. But we don't always see that every day. The two most common mental health disorders are depression and anxiety, and that's what we see many folks struggling with in this day and age. Last one is bipolar disorder, and this involves episodes of mood swings, ranging from manic highs to manic lows. Again, we don't see this as commonly, but if you're finding that your moods are either up all the way 100% to low, it's something to look out for. Again, these are just tools to have in your toolkit if you start finding that your mental health is getting in the way of your every single day life. But we're not focusing on this for this presentation just because mental health can be just everyday maintenance. So this is a quote I always like to say: mental health affects everyone differently. Again, these are just tools in a toolkit. I'm giving you information and things to kind of file away, store away, but everyone is affected by mental health differently. As it was said in my introduction, I work in a women's shelter, and the women that we have at our shelter, everyone is affected differently by their situations, right? Someone who could be struggling with feeling really anxious, what their everyday life looks like can look very different than someone who's struggling with feeling very low, very sad. So it's important to note everyone is different. Everyone is affected by mental health differently. And again, these are just things to watch out for if you start not feeling good. So I like to put in a case study just to kind of give you an example of what declining mental health can look like. These are just imaginary examples. They're not real, but they can give you a little bit of an idea of maybe someone else or with yourself, you start to feel not so good. And this can kind of just paint a picture. So we'll start with Susie here. So Susie, a 28-year-old barista, has started to feel anxious at work. So she's starting to feel a little bit of panic. She's starting to feel worried. The cafe that she works at is fast-paced and intense. If anyone is a barista here, you know that it can get very fast-paced and intense. So she's starting to feel anxious. She's starting to panic a little bit at work. After having a panic attack, she decides to reach out to a counselor for help, which is our great first step. We'll get into steps for asking for help. But this is, she's feeling anxious. She's starting to feel out of control at work. She's not feeling good. So her next steps are, let me get some help. Her counselor provides her with breathing techniques to manage her stress and anxiety. Susie sees her counselor monthly for check-ins. So again, this is a great example. Susie doesn't have a mental health disorder, but she's struggling with feeling anxious, and those feelings are so valid and so important to look at. So she goes for help. She sees a counselor, she gets some breathing techniques, so when she's at work, she's able to better deal with those feelings of nervousness. Then we move on to Jonathan. This is our second case study. So Jonathan, a 35-year-old engineer, has been feeling overwhelmed by his responsibilities at work and home. He feels like a failure despite his professional success and struggles to maintain relationships with his family. So we see here in this example of Jonathan that his mental health is starting to get in the way of his everyday life. These are red flags that we're seeing. He's struggling to maintain relationships with his family, his loved ones. This is when we start to go, oh, maybe there's something bigger going on here. So Jonathan decides to go to the doctor. After seeking help from a doctor, Jonathan is diagnosed with depression. Again, it's different for everyone. You may not get a diagnosis. You may just be struggling with feelings and regular mental health every day. But in this case study, in this example, Jonathan has depression. He's then prescribed medication and receives biweekly therapy. So what's important to note here and to look at here, again, is that, as I said, mental health affects everyone differently, but there are different courses of action and different supports you can get based on what you're struggling with. We look at Susie, who's just starting to feel a little bit of panic. She's feeling a little bit of worry at work. There's things in place that Susie here can do and has done to start to feel better. And equally with Jonathan in this example, his mental health is getting in the way of his every single day life. He's feeling like a failure. These are really big feelings, and he doesn't have to go through it alone, and he gets help, which brings us kind of to our next slide, our next discussion. So recognizing the signs. So after we kind of reflect and think, how am I feeling in my everyday life? How are my feelings and my thoughts affecting me? We start to recognize the signs, and this is a really important part about managing and taking care of our mental health. So we acknowledge and educate. This means accepting the challenges that you're facing and learn about your feelings. Sometimes in life, it's really hard to take a second and to think about how we're feeling. We're all busy. We all have jobs. We're all doing lots of things in our everyday life. And sometimes it's hard to take a second and to be like, how am I feeling today? And how are these feelings affecting me? But the very first step to feeling better, to looking at our mental health, is to really accept the challenges that we're facing and to reflect about, what am I feeling? Why are these feelings here? What are these feelings doing? The next thing, we monitor our symptoms. So some different ideas. Some people like to take a journal. They like to keep a journal of their symptoms. They like to write down, today I'm feeling this. Today these feelings came up. This is a really great way to log what you're feeling. Sometimes it's easier to write down your feelings than it is to say them out loud. A lot of times the work that I do at a women's shelter, we get our residents to keep a log every day of what they're feeling, the things they're going through. And this is a really great tool to help better understand kind of where your thoughts are at, where your emotions are at. The next is triggers. And this, again, differs from person to person. But if you're finding something specific that is making you not feel good, you're seeing a common theme. This one thing is what is affecting my mental health. That's a trigger, and that's something that you can monitor and keep in your symptoms journal, or keep a note of, this isn't making me feel good. Our third step, which is, in my opinion, one of the most important, is to reach out for help. And this says, talk to a trusted person, talk to trusted people, and seek professional help. So the biggest disconnect with our mental health is that a lot of folks find it very difficult to ask for help. There's a stigma sometimes around mental health where it's hard to say, hey, I'm struggling, or hey, this is hard, or hey, this is how I'm feeling. And a lot of folks don't want to reach out for help. They don't want to admit that they're struggling with their mental health. But reaching out for help is the most important. And this is something, again, the work I do at the women's shelter, we tell all of our residents, it's so good that you're here. It's so good that you've come, because asking for help, reaching out for help is the first step. So if we go through all these toolkits and you say, okay, I'm looking at my life and I'm feeling these feelings and I'm struggling, we reach out for help. That's our next step. And it's important, even if you may be hesitant. Some folks say that they can feel like a failure for admitting that they're struggling with their mental health. But everyone is struggling. Everyone struggles, and it's important to go to someone, whether that's a professional, whether that's a friend, whether that's a family member, someone you trust, to say, hey, I think I'm struggling. The next step is developing a support plan. So again, this looks different for everybody depending on what you're struggling with. Some folks need therapy, or seeing a counselor, or seeing someone and talking about their feelings. This might not apply to everyone, but it can be really helpful for folks who have been through some really difficult times, who have been through some really difficult things. Having someone you trust and someone you can talk to. For some folks, that might look like medication. We looked at that example with Jonathan in our case study. Jonathan was diagnosed with depression. He may need medication in his everyday life. Again, this doesn't apply to everyone. There are many instances where medication is not needed and we can just work on our thoughts and our feelings, but it's something to be aware of because there are support plans in place that we can do. And lifestyle changes. Now, this is a huge thing, especially for more minor mental health challenges. Sometimes it's important to take a look at our life and say, okay, what is working, what isn't working, and what is making me feel not good? So when we look at lifestyle changes, sometimes we think about, who am I surrounding myself with? Are my friends positive influences in my life, or my friends negative influences in my life? How do the people in my circle make me feel? Because a lot of times we forget to look at how the routines in our life affect our mental health. So mental health can be affected by so many different things. We look at our friends, we look at our family, we look at our job, we look at the things we do every day. And it's important to say, how does this make me feel? Because if you have people or friends in your life or situations, or you're in a workplace that is negatively affecting your mental health, and we don't do anything to change that, our mental health is going to continue to get worse. So it's very important to look at what our everyday life looks like and how that affects our mental health. So if you're saying, oh my goodness, I'm feeling anxious. When I'm around these people, they make me feel anxious. That's a negative effect on my mental health. It's important to, when we're looking at a support plan of how to feel better, saying, maybe I don't want to hang out with these people anymore. Maybe this job isn't a good fit for me because I constantly feel anxious. Maybe doing this specific activity, I should start doing less. And these are things to look at how our everyday life impacts how we're feeling and how it shapes our thoughts. So this is a very important slide, asking for help. And it highlights that asking for help can look very different from person to person. But in my opinion, again, asking for help is one of the most important things when you're dealing with your mental health. The first is reach out to friends, family, and support groups. This can be your very first tool. You start not to feel good. You're not really understanding your feelings. You're not feeling good mentally. Your thoughts are negative. Talk to a friend. Talk to someone you trust. There are a lot of support groups online that you can look up, and I'll go into resources as well later. This is building a community around yourself of folks that lift you up. And the thing to note here is life is hard. We're all going through a lot of difficult things in our everyday life. So having someone, a friend, a family member, someone you trust to talk to, that's the first step. And it's very important. And we typically always have somebody, whether it's someone very close to you, a support group online. These are things that we can do to talk about how we're feeling. And it always, without fail, works. The next step is find a counselor, psychiatrist, psychologist. Again, this might not be something that everyone needs, but if you're finding, oh my goodness, my feelings, the things I'm going through, my thoughts are taking over and I need someone to talk to give me advice and give me a toolkit, this is when we start looking at, okay, there's counselors, psychiatrists, psychologists available. In both of our case studies with Susie and Jonathan, they realized, okay, I need some help from a professional. And a lot of times for folks, that can be scary. That can be really scary going to try and find support elsewhere. And we'll talk about some of the barriers that exist to finding a counselor, a psychiatrist, or psychologist, because there are many. And those barriers exist, which make it even harder to want to go get help. But I'm letting you know that these supports are available, and it's okay to go see a professional if you need it, because that's what they're there for. The next is make an appointment for an assessment. Now, whether you're seeing a counselor, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, any professional help, what will happen is you'll have a consultation or an appointment to assess what you're struggling with. And in these appointments, we go through, okay, what are you feeling? What are you struggling with? And what's our action plan? So the great thing about going to see a professional, if you need the help, is that they will guide you. They will assess what you're dealing with, what you're feeling, what your thoughts are looking like. And then from there, we can make an action plan of what you need to start feeling better. So that initial appointment will always be, let's assess where you are. This is a tool, a hotline for immediate support. Now, there are some situations where we find ourselves in crisis. We start feeling so overwhelmed that we need immediate help. And a hotline exists for this exact reason. The shelter that I work at, we have a 24/7 hotline for women who need support. There are many hotlines out there. I have a list of resources in my next slides. So if you're feeling in a crisis point where you're like, oh my goodness, I need help right now, hotlines exist. And a lot of folks don't actually know that those are a resource that they can use. There's many different hotlines for different groups of individuals, and we'll go into that. But just know that if you get to a point where you're in a crisis, and again, this might not be for everyone, but it does happen, that there are hotlines that you can call, give a call, someone will pick up, and you can have a conversation. The next is visit websites for information. Now, a lot of folks don't realize that they can do a Google search and lots of resources come up. And I have some resources in my presentation as well that may apply to you. There's lots of tools online. If you input something you're struggling with, something you're looking for, resources come up. Not to say that we should always turn to the internet to deal with our mental health, but it is good to know that there are things online and things in place that we can look for if we want resources. This is also a quote that I like to put in all of my presentations, that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to be honest about how you're feeling, and it's okay to not be okay. This is really, really, really important. This is something I tell a lot of my clients. This is something that I tell myself every single day, that it's okay to struggle. There's no shame in struggling. It's okay to ask for help. This is where we find mental health as an umbrella, mental health professionals. This is where the stigma lies, that a lot of people find that they're ashamed to acknowledge, hey, I'm struggling, or hey, my mental health isn't good, or hey, I'm not doing well, I need some help. This can be hard for a lot of folks. But in this presentation, the biggest takeaway that I want you to have is that it's okay to ask for help. And if you're not feeling good, it's okay to be like, hey, I want to feel better, and that's okay. A lot of times in life, sometimes it's easy to pretend like everything's fine and we're doing fine, but the reality is a lot of us are struggling, and it's okay to not be okay. And that's why these resources are in place. So this is the part of the presentation where we start talking about barriers. And I think, especially in Canada, especially for communities that are marginalized, it's important to understand and acknowledge these barriers because they really do exist. So as easy as I have said, you should reach out for help, there are barriers and things in place that make it a little bit hard to reach out for help, and that deters a lot of folks from getting the supports they need. So these are just things to be aware of, things that we can keep in our pocket. Again, I always say in our toolkit, and things that exist in our world. So say we're not feeling well. Our mental health isn't positive. We're having negative thoughts. And we go and we want to seek help. There can be barriers that get in the way of that. And the first is economic barriers. So limited financial resources can make it difficult to afford mental health services. Unfortunately, it can be a financial struggle to receive mental health support. Something to be aware of. There are many different programs, many different free online resources, free counseling sessions, but it's a barrier that exists, and I think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes getting this type of help can be a financial strain. Lack of insurance coverage. This is another point that some folks struggle with, that sometimes insurance plans may have limited coverage for mental health or for medication. This is just unfortunately a reality that sometimes our insurance covers minimal services. Cultural stigma. This is something big that I see in the work I do at my women's shelter, is that sometimes culturally that there are stigmas that can cause fear of judgment or shame. In some cultures, mental health isn't talked about. Mental health is seen as not even a real thing, and that's something to take note of. Sometimes families don't believe that mental health is real. They don't believe in getting support. And again, that's just something to be aware of. Language barriers. This is something that I feel like isn't talked about enough in Canada, but for our non-English speakers or where English isn't their first language, it may be difficult to find culturally and linguistically suitable supports. Again, I have some resources that we're going to go through, but this is something that exists in our society. And limited availability of providers. This is another thing I see a lot in the work that I do, that sometimes there are shortages of providers who specialize in issues affecting marginalized communities. Now, for example, the women's shelter I work at, we specifically focus on women fleeing domestic violence and abuse. That's a specific kind of group of people. But we find sometimes that there is a lack of professionals that deal with other specific areas. So again, these aren't to say that you will not get help. These aren't to deter you from asking for help. But I think in the conversation of mental health, it's important to be aware that there are some things that may make it difficult. But again, this should never deter you from reaching out for help, for asking for help. These are just things to be aware of. So if you're struggling to find someone and you're like, oh, this has been really challenging, these are some reasons of why it could be. So this is a statistic that I like to put in presentations. Visible minority groups were 27.8% more likely to report poor mental health. This is an important statistic and something that I also feel like isn't talked about often, that when we look at marginalized communities, there's an even more struggle, an even bigger need. So when I say that it's okay to not be okay, this is a message that is specifically very important for minority groups, because oftentimes those are the groups of folks that are struggling the most. And in the statistic, this is from Stats Canada, 27.8% more. That's crazy, right? That's a big number. So it's important to note that there are cultural pieces and minority pieces that contribute to our mental health. So this is a slide that I think is also very important in this type of presentation about resources. So I've talked about acknowledging your symptoms, reaching out for help. And the next question is, well, where do I reach out for help? These are some resources that I have found that are targeted for marginalized communities. But again, it's a Google search away, which is very important to note, that we can just go online and we can look for the type of support we need. But I'm going to run through each of these four. These are four of many that exist, many that are free, many that are online that can be used. These are just some that I thought would be important to highlight in this type of presentation. So the first is the Trevor Project. This is crisis intervention and suicide prevention services for LGBTQ+ youth, including a 24/7 helpline and chat. Trevor Project has done some amazing work, and for at-risk LGBTQ+ youth, these types of resources are really important. So that's just something to note. The Trevor Project exists. Inclusive therapists. Now, this was a great resource that I found, that I was very excited that I found. And this provides a directory of therapists who will offer care specifically for your unique identity. So as we talked about in the last slide, sometimes there are barriers for culturally, linguistically, This type of resources, inclusive therapists, this is where you'll have the most success if you decide you need to reach out for help. Again, this may not be what you need, but again, there are things in place if you're looking for someone that targets specifically your unique identity. Inclusive therapists is a resource. Trans Lifeline, this is a hotline. Again, we talked about hotlines for trans people, staffed by trans people. So for folks who are part of the trans community, there are things in place for them as well. And the last one is ASHA International. This is a very great resource that I found, and it empowers immigrants, refugees, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBTQ plus youth to share their stories. This is another example of an online support group where you may find some comfort and some support and folks who have also gone through a similar struggle or story. So again, these are things to just note. These are resources that exist. All right, mental health takeaways. Everyone struggles with mental health. It is much more common than we talk about a lot of times. Everyone can struggle with their thoughts and their feelings. Seeking help is the first step to feeling better. So you being here for this presentation, you watching this presentation, this is a step that you are doing to better your mental health, which is fantastic. And a lot of folks don't even get to this point where they think, this is a workshop or this is a seminar that I would like to take. Everyone deserves a happy, healthy life. This is a very, very important point that I will scream to the rooftops, that everyone deserves happiness and health in their life. Even when times get hard, even when we're struggling, it can feel like life is meant to be this way, but I can advocate for the fact that everyone deserves a happy, healthy life, and whatever supports you need and things we need to put in place to achieve that, that's important. Life doesn't have to always be a struggle. And when we start looking at our mental health every single day, when we start looking at how we're feeling, how we're thinking, how those thoughts affect what we're doing, then we can start to create a better, healthy life. The next is that mental health disorders are treatable. We covered mental health disorders very briefly, but this is something that also isn't always in the discussion, that they are treatable, that there are things in place that can improve mental health. A lot of times in the work that I do at the shelter, we have women who come in who say, I have depression and there's nothing, I've had depression for many years and there's nothing that we can do about it. And our counselors and the people that work at the shelter, we go, okay, let's look at your life. And when we look at their life and the things that they've been through, it makes sense. We're like, okay, yes, this is why you're feeling depressed. And there are things in place that these disorders can be treated. So many folks, more than you know, struggle with depression and anxiety. It's so extremely common in our society. And what's important is to not only acknowledge that and know that they are treatable, that you don't have to feel these negative, heavy mental health challenges forever. They are treatable. And the last point is that you are not alone. A lot of times when we're struggling with our mental health, how we're feeling, it can feel like we're alone in the battle. We're alone in the struggle. Only we know what this feels like, but the reality is that you aren't alone, that there are people around the world who are also struggling, who are also having a difficult time, who are also going through the things that you're going through, and that you're not alone. This is why we talk about the importance of reaching out to friends, to family, if you start feeling not good in your thoughts and your feelings, that you aren't alone in the battle. You're not alone in what you're going through, that there are people who have been through the similar or same thing, and that they're there to guide you and support you. The fact that we have counselors, mental health specialists, just proves that there are so many people who are going through a similar struggle, that you are not alone. And these are very important takeaways when we talk about mental health, because again, there are things in our society and things in our lives that tell us that mental health isn't an important conversation to have. Mental health isn't real. Mental health shouldn't be the forefront. But when we look at even the definition of mental health is our thoughts, it's our feelings, it's what's going on in our brains every single day, and that can shape how we experience life. Very, very important. So if there's anything you can take away from this presentation, it's that you are not alone, that there are things in place that you can do to feel better. And whether that's going to see a professional, whether that's just making changes in your everyday life, whether that's keeping a journal to know how you're feeling, what your thoughts are looking like, whatever that looks like, could be different for everyone. These are things that are in place. So that kind of brings us near the end of our presentation. I like to reserve a little bit of time just for questions or for discussion. I think, especially in the mental health conversation, it's important that we keep these discussions positive. We keep these discussions in a very kind of professional way. So I open up the floor if anyone has questions or if they want to discuss anything that was taken. But I think it's important that we have these respectful conversations. So if anyone has anything they want to add or want to ask or want to mention, we have some time near the end to discuss.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you. So yeah, wonderful information. Like, the mental health concept is still new kind of in society, but especially like from the countries that most of us are coming, it's just more like it's newer. And there, as you mentioned, there's lots of stigmas around it. So they are wonderful information, and thank you so much. And some of the quotes that you said, like, you're not alone and it's okay not to be okay. So these are like wonderful things that we have to keep in mind. I was just wondering, like, from your experience, is there any programs like associated with the community practices, like let's say like community centers or some programs that could bring people who are having like similar, let's say, like going through similar, like, let's say, part of their life, like issues, let's say, or challenges? Like, is there any programs in communities, like from the place that you're coming or in Canada? Because I haven't really heard, like, maybe there's a stigma or they couldn't be successful because, like, yeah, like like it seems like I'm going through like depression or the other people, because we say like you are not alone, but it's still in the society, it feels like you're kind of alone. But
Yes. Yeah, so I agree and have seen that in communities, especially in smaller communities in Canada and in Ontario, that we don't have a lot of community resources. Even the shelter that I work at, a lot of folks in community don't even know that it's there and that it exists. And again, this is a very like niche specific line of work that I'm in. But even in my community, I'm in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. There isn't a community center where you can just go in. It's really like you have to go to a doctor, you have to go to a walk-in. So I think the biggest, best piece of advice is to do a little Google search to look, because sometimes they exist and we don't know, or they don't exist at all, which is really, really a shame, because I feel like especially for marginalized communities, like that type of community support is really important. And there should be places where someone can just come in and be like, hey, I'm working through this. So it seems that in this digital age we live in, that online groups and forums are our only or best option, because there aren't in-person facilities for this type of thing. However, sometimes we're surprised. A lot of women who come to the shelter I work at, they were like, oh, we didn't even know that this existed. We just looked up, I'm in crisis, I need help, and then they find our shelter. So yeah, it is unfortunate. And I feel that especially in smaller communities that there needs to be more kind of community supports in place, that someone can just come and walk in and get help. But it seems that online sometimes is our best bet. But it does come down, unfortunately, to kind of looking and doing a little search and seeing what there is out there. But I do wish, and I agree that I wish there was more in community and in-person facilities that could really support folks.
Yeah, and it seems like we lack the kind of like a centralized like resource, like an app or something that like you can refer, like those like old yellow books that like used to have like everything in there. Like you
Yeah,
just go like, yeah, when you have it, like when you're going under crisis or in you're like searching for something, like honestly, as a newcomer, like even the community centers are totally new concept. Like no one knows. Like I was talking with a mother and she was like, I've been here for 10 years, but because I'm not going to university, I'm not having a job. I didn't know that there is a concept as like a community centers. Like the concepts are so new. Like there is nothing like that in our countries. So like
Yes.
knowing even there is like an app maybe, or I have no idea, like there's something like
Yeah.
centralized for that region at least. I think it's very essential. It seems in Canada to, yeah,
Mhm.
to have.
And I will say there are applications that can be downloaded for like mood tracking or for things like that for journaling. And there are apps that I've seen and that some of our residents use that are like will give you some positive affirmations or some
Mhm.
meditations. There are mental health apps that are great for that type of thing. They're free and that just can kind of help you log what you're feeling, kind of give you some motivation. I do agree that there should be, kind of a more data-based kind of resource for folks and newcomers. But there are apps and they do exist and they can
Yeah.
be for tracking how you're feeling, giving you some motivation, giving you some boosts. Um, I even have an app on my phone that just gives me every day like affirmations. And when I wake up
Mhm.
in the morning, it'll
Nice.
just give me something. And I'm like, okay, today's going to be an okay day. So there are a couple on the App Store, but yeah, I totally agree that I wish there was
Wonderful.
a little bit more for our newcomers for sure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank
Is there
you.
any questions?
Yeah. Uh, would you explain a little more detail? What does it mean, attack? Would you
Yeah,
give an
sure.
example?
So panic attacks are, I'm going to try and break it down in the simplest way. So when we have anxiety, when we have fear, when we start to panic, those are kind of feelings internally, but a panic attack is kind of a bigger physical manifestation of that. So when a panic attack happens, people find that they might have difficulty breathing. The panic becomes so intense that their breathing gets short. They're in basically kind of a crisis situation. Um, Panic attacks are actually a lot more common than um, a lot of people know. I At the shelter we have a couple of women who struggle with that type of situation. But it's basically like a sense of panic that becomes so extreme that it becomes a panic attack. So it's you're having shortness of breath, you're in a state of extreme panic. Um, they're nothing to worry about, however, because there are breathing techniques and things like I mentioned in the presentation that can kind of ground you. But I will say a lot of people who have a panic attack for the first time, they're like, oh my God, am I having a heart attack? No, it's just an overwhelming sense of panic that can come over and then it kind of manifests in your body. So some things that can happen is like I said, it becomes difficult to breathe. Some people really need to kind of sit down when they're in this panic. It becomes very overwhelming. This isn't something that happens to everybody, but again, it's just something to look for. If you find yourself, okay, I'm not just anxious, I'm having these attacks where I'm finding it hard to breathe, I'm in this intense panic, that's what a panic attack is. But again, there's breathing, there's meditation, there's things that we can do to kind of calm our heart rate, calm the panic, and that's part of kind of the mental health discussion of what tools do we have in place to kind of combat these feelings of fear. But again, doesn't happen to everybody, but that's kind of what it looks like for most.
And one person asked if when somebody is old, needs someone to take care of that person, which one is you believe is preferred to stay with the family, or they can deliver it to one of those centers to take care of the old.
Yeah, so our older populations, that's definitely something in my opinion that is kind of a case by case thing. A lot of our older communities haven't had those mental health discussions, and there was a big stigma when they were younger. Um, so oftentimes it comes to kind of the family or people in their lives to take care of those things. I will say that while it comes case by case, like we have some older women and families that come into our shelter that are like, we don't really know what to do here. Our grandma or mother is really struggling. Um, I think it's important to look at how what they're feeling not only impacts them, but the families and the people in their lives and assess from there. If it's a case where they need constant support, they need professional help, and that can't be provided by the family, there are things in place where you can go to a center where you can go and they can get that support. But again, depends case by case. But there is kind of a stigma in our older populations of mental health challenges. Oftentimes, even the residents we get at the shelter are very hesitant and they don't believe in mental health, even though they are struggling. So I think part of being a friend, part of being a daughter, part of being a family member is to kind of look out for the people in your life. And if they're struggling, I think bringing them to a community center or something for support is important.
And I believe the culture is very, very important in the family, in old people, that many people from other countries, they believe the old people, they must stay with the family.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't have any definition for them that, yeah, I'm leaving my family to stay with
Yes.
centers. It is a very, yeah, culture is very important issue on this stuff, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And for sure, especially when, you know, our families are a lot of times all we have. And for our newcomers, like they're coming with family and they want to stay within family, it can be scary to even venture outside of that. But I think in this topic of mental health discussion, the same way I'm saying that you are not alone, things to look at for yourself as well, you can apply these things to the people in your life. So if you're seeing someone in your close circle, your friends, your family that you see are struggling, you can equally have those conversations of, okay, how are you feeling? What's going on and what can we do about it? So equally as important it is to take care of ourselves when it comes to family and especially mothers and our older population, to keep an eye and know that these resources are in place. I mean, there is a lot of cultural barriers there and a lot of hesitation, I find. But even just having conversations of how are you feeling today? What's going on? Those conversations can be important and can really change the trajectory of someone's day.
And also, too much questions, sorry. Uh, I believe getting help, because most of the time you was talking who is the right person to get help. If you
Mm-hmm.
have these kind of problems, maybe AI is the advanced AI these days coming is much better option because of many. First of all, what they say, it is much more professional.
Mm-hmm.
The second is your privacy,
Yeah.
because you are talking to your friend, maybe the next day you around the city, everyone knows you have a problem. But in AI, there is a minimum of at least privacy.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. I mean, I have seen, like myself, people kind of type into an AI chat or into an AI bot and say, "Hey, I'm in this situation. What advice would you give me?" I've seen people literally kind of use AI as a tool of almost a therapist or a counselor where they're just able to kind of type in. Um, I definitely think that in bigger, more crisis situations, like seeing a counselor would trump that. But for everyday just feelings and hey, I'm feeling this or hey, I need some help, AI is a great tool. And like you said, privacy. Sometimes it's scary to be, if you're in a smaller community, to trust someone with the things that you're feeling. And sometimes when it goes bigger than asking a friend or someone close to you, AI definitely is a tool that can be used. Like ChatGPT is the first thing that comes to mind. You can easily just type in, I'm feeling stressed today about this, and then it'll kind of generate some support. So that 100% is something that can be done.
question.
Sure.
No, anyone.
Oh, any other questions? Yes. Here, I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Yes.
There is one question in the chat. It says, what advice would you give to someone afraid to seek help?
Here, let me see here. Afraid to seek help. Yeah. So it's a tough one because when that fear is there and when it's different and unique in every situation, I think the next step would be, why are you afraid to seek help? Right? Looking at what is that fear rooted in? I mean, general advice, I know I said you're not alone, but I think it's important to note that, like, yourself, you deserve to feel better. A lot of folks and people who are struggling with their mental health are also struggling with self-esteem and their confidence, and they feel like themselves like this internal, I don't deserve to feel better, I don't deserve good things. And I find that a lot in our residents where they're afraid to get help because A, they're afraid to acknowledge that they're struggling, and B, because they have low self-esteem, low confidence, and they feel like I don't deserve to feel better. And a lot of times when we go through these really hard things and we're struggling, it can take a big hit to our self-confidence and our self-esteem. And then we feel like maybe I don't deserve this. Maybe my life should be hard, and we get used to that. But I think if we unpack that feeling, you can ask yourself, why am I afraid? Why am I afraid to get help? And from there, you can say, okay, I'm afraid to get help because I'm scared of what my friends will think of me. From there, you can kind of look at where that thought is coming from and where that fear is coming from, and we can unpack it further. Are you afraid to get help because you're afraid that it's going to be a hard journey? Or are you afraid to ask for help because you're afraid someone is going to turn you away? Like, those are things to look at. But ultimately, like, I will always say that we deserve to live a happy, healthy life. We deserve to feel good. And regardless of what has happened in your life, regardless of the struggle that we've faced, that you deserve the help and you deserve the good things. So that's just some general advice. But sometimes it's good to unpack, okay, where does that fear come from and why am I feeling that fear? I don't know if that was helpful for that specific question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes, there is no other questions. Yeah, it seems so. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you very much. It was like lovely to hear and learn more about. There is no end in learning, and thank you so much in doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a wonderful weekend. Long weekend, actually. Wonderful.
Yes.
It's great.